lives in a dream, waits at the window, wearing the face that she keeps in a jar.
Between 7,000 and 55,000, but likely closer to 7,000 women who enlisted in the Army saw action in Vietnam, most as nurses. Few had been recruited because there were a large number of female volunteers, a significant number of whom requested to go to Vietnam specifically. Most of them are white, middle class, Catholic, and a few years older than the soldiers, as they often attended 3-year diploma Catholic nursing schools before enlisting.
Women enlisted for a myriad of reasons. Some hoped to bring people back home, or went because it seemed the humanitarian thing to do. Others went to Vietnam as adventurers who wanted to see what war was like. Still others were influenced in their decision by pop culture characters including Florence Nightingale and Cherry Ames. Pop culture figures inhabited an idealized version of war, one in which working as a nurse in a war zone was a noble endeavor undertaken by women in perfect white uniforms. In reality, nurses in Vietnam found the supplies they needed to be healthy themselves were often sorely lacking. One Vietnam nurse testified that the PX in Saigon had contained only the bare necessities, and they were geared towards an all-male population. Another commented, "I was afraid of being taken prisoner and not having any Tampax. You couldn't count on being in the jungle and using a leaf because the jungle was defoliated. My flak jacket was so full of Tampax that nothing could have penetrated it." Nurses worked 15-hour shifts each day, often in poor working conditions without proper supplies. Captain Robbie Cooper reported in a letter to her superior that deliveries to the medical dispensary contained minimal and largely inappropriate supplies and equipment, often without anesthesia, surgical equipment, or ward supplies. As such, nurses stationed throughout Vietnam were forced to improvise. Lieutenant Peggy Adams became known for her ability to do just that. When her unit was without the glass rods necessary for bowel surgery, Lieutenant Adams procured aluminum rods normally used for equipment repairs and hand-sanded them into appropriate replacements.
While nurses suffered from a lack of supplies, an additional difficulty of serving was that their role was not limited to nursing. They served also as surrogate mothers, wives, and girlfriends to their male counterparts. Because of this, the nurses often felt that they could not be successful as they were performing too many roles simultaneously.
Susan O'Neill, who served as a nurse in Vietnam, reflects on her relationships with her patients in her poem, Volunteering at the Orphanage, Hue, Vietnam, 1969. She writes, "Here I offer listless skull-faced babies in bare wood-slat cribs, bottles of despair in lieu of love, they suck with no will. I hold the babies. After, outside, in the sun-baked courtyard, I hold them all, one by one, until the jeep returns. It is my penance that is not enough for any of us." This excerpt recalls O'Neill's experience caring for children in an orphanage, and implies a comparison to nurses' experience caring for wounded soldiers, emphasizing both the helplessness of the wounded in Vietnam and the sense of failure that nurses felt upon the death of a patient.
Some nurses became involved socially and intimately with their compatriots, sometimes drinking and smoking with soldiers or having affairs with married doctors who would ultimately become victims of the violence they fought or left Vietnam when their service ended.
I used to think of it as my Eleanor Rigby face that I kept in the jar by the door, who was it for all the lonely people. I would simply put on my makeup and put on my Eleanor Rigby face, and I was Emily Strange Donut Dolly.
Facing the carnage of the war was traumatic. 57,000 soldiers perished and 270,000 more were injured in combat. Nurses mechanized a system of aid in which they transferred men from combat to the emergency room in half an hour. Amidst this fast-paced form of care, nurses were subject to an incredible amount of gore in the form of mixtures of mutilated appendages. A Northwestern State University study found that more than half of female veterans surveyed had been sexually attacked during their service, whether that be in the form of a sexual insult or rape. One officer reportedly offered to award a Bronze Star to a nurse if she would sleep with her commander, while another nurse was berated by a patient for being seductive. Upon their return to the States, women were not completely removed from the violence. Acknowledgement of their service was met with hostility, and a large portion of the women were suffering from anxiety, depression, insomnia, flashbacks, suicidal ideation, and other symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. They showed increasing emotional numbness and distrust in their peers, as well as towards the government. 65% said they felt alienated from the government, and 57% felt they had been used by it. This was a marked shift in policy for those who had volunteered to serve, believing that serving was a just way to involve oneself in the war.
One notable female Vietnam veteran was Lydia Van Deventer. She served as a nurse at the 71st Evacuation Hospital in Pleiku, After returning home, she became an advocate for her fellow women veterans. Van Devanter created the Women's Project of the Vietnam Veterans of America, which helped deal with the concerns of 7,000 plus women who served in Vietnam. Her 1983 memoir, Home Before Morning, was the first full-length, first-hand account of the nurses' experience in Vietnam.
The Women's Army Corps was founded in 1942 as a branch of the Army. In the Vietnam era, it was decided that there would be an expansion of the Women's Army Corps in order to accommodate the growing and more long-term investment that was occurring overseas. Director of the Corps, Lieutenant Colonel Elizabeth Hosington, was a major force in leading the organization. She advocated for the promotion of officers and the expansion of the recruitment tactics in order to recruit more women to the cause. In 1964, the first women were sent to Vietnam as part of a small group of about 30. They were led by Major Kathleen Wilkes and Sergeant First Class Betty Adams, seen here in this video clip from 1965, working to help train the Vietnamese Women's Army. Wilkes, Adams, and their charges also worked as stenographers, cryptographers, and typists for General Westmoreland in Saigon. Their contribution to the American efforts was recognized, and in 1966, the Women's Army Corps expanded by 38%, focusing on adding more jobs that were equal tasks with men's jobs. Along with this, they also sent about 110 women to Vietnam as part of a WAC detachment unit, located about 30 miles from Saigon and Long Binh. The Long Binh Air Base was a major target for the Viet Cong, and although no women died there, the base was frequently hit. These women worked in jobs such as clerks, officers, typists, journalists, and nurses, as well as volunteered in local communities and orphanages. A woman was generally assigned to a year's tour of duty and was replaced after their tour ended. However, many chose to come back for another year or two. 8 nurses died in Vietnam, most due to illness or accidents. The women's names can be found on the Vietnam Memorial Wall. The only one to die from enemy fire was Sharon Ann Lane, who was born in Zanesville, Ohio, about an hour southeast of Gambier. Between 1964 and 1972, over 700 WACs were stationed in Vietnam. Many women earned medals and awards for their service, including one who earned a Purple Heart. Though the decision to send women overseas was initially met with resistance from those who feared it was not safe or ladylike, their service was generally appreciated and thanked by Army officers in the post-war era. General Engler of the Army stated that the women were, quote, outstanding at their positions and that not utilizing their skills would have been, quote, a serious mistake. In 1978, the Women's Army Corps was officially disbanded and integrated into the previously all-male Army. The end of the WAC marked a new chapter of service for women in the military, an integration that stemmed from their admirable service in Vietnam.
Civilian women became involved in the Vietnam War largely as journalists or through civilian agencies like the American Red Cross, the Army Special Services, United Service Organizations, the Peace Corps, and Catholic Relief Services. Because no formal record was taken of how many of these women served in Vietnam during the conflict, their exact number is not known. Even after leaving the United States, these women were still confined to traditional American female roles that were simply auxiliary to the service of their male counterparts. In addition to medical relief, civilian women provided so-called pink-collar services, such as clerical work, bookkeeping, and loan assistance to personnel dealing with family emergencies back home. The duties of women serving in Vietnam were also predominantly in the realm of recreation. As part of organizations like the Red Cross, the Army Special Services, and United Service Organizations, they entertained personnel, provided them with refreshments, and organized recreation programs to boost morale among the soldiers. These kinds of jobs earned these women the nickname donut dollies among servicemen. Because of the incredibly low ratio of women to men in Vietnam, non-military women were a rare sight for most male soldiers. Treated as tokens, they were praised for their mere visibility in the bleak war zones of Vietnam rather than for their capabilities as service women. Years after the war, one of these women reflected on her reputation on the battlefield. She, like many other of the women who provided recreational services to servicemen, fulfilled the role of the all-American girl, stating, "We were there to represent Mom, Apple Pie, and the girl next door, to let them know that somebody does care about why they were there. We cared enough to leave the United States and all that comfort to be there with them and all that discomfort." Still, civilian women faced their own horrors in Vietnam, often created by the very men they were serving. They were made victims of crime, such as theft, rape, and violence, and were scapegoated by soldiers avoiding punishment for their own irresponsibility. The Vietnam Women's Memorial Foundation states that 59 women died during the Vietnam conflict.
Other women traveled to Vietnam as foreign correspondents for news organizations. Publications generally discouraged female employees from traveling to Vietnam as news correspondents during the 60s, and women often had to pay for their own airfare and work as freelancers, as did New York Times writer Gloria Emerson, if they wanted to cover the war. Female journalists also faced backlash from military officers, who often viewed the presence of women for any reason as a distraction. Interestingly, women with press passes were often viewed as moral boosts by the military and were often asked to pose for photos with troops. In the field, female journalists encountered obstacles such as social isolation. They spent often months at a time with only the company of male soldiers, and safety hazards. Female news correspondents covered soldiers' experiences, what the war was like at both a personal and a practical level, and often live combat. They relayed what was going on in the war to people back home, with a focus on the American rather than the Vietnamese side of the conflict. Some women, like Dickie Chappelle, also worked as photojournalists. Covering a male-dominated war gave women an outsider perspective that often served as an advantage. Edith Lederer, who worked for the AP during the war, explained this during a panel 2 years ago as a part of the museum exhibit on the Vietnam War.
Because one of the things I learned instantly on arriving in Vietnam was there were so few American women there that you could basically talk to any man about anything, and particularly in the military, where I actually did not know that much, you could ask them to explain things to you, or you could ask what might sound like a stupid question coming from a man, and often would elicit great quotes for a story.
During the panel discussion, Lederer said that Vietnam was the war everyone wanted to forget, and explained that female journalists weren't directly acknowledged for their achievements regarding the war right away. However, female coverage of Vietnam contributed to the U.S. perception of who could successfully convey news and the way in which the nation viewed the war. Women who worked as war reporters solidified the women's liberation movement as it applied to career reform both in the media and the military, providing crucial and unique insight into the war during the process.
Upon returning from the war, the majority of women who served did not receive proper recognition for their efforts because they were not seen as actual soldiers. The public did not believe that the women who served had it nearly as bad as the men who did, and people back home in America did not realize that women also served near the front lines and were not always in their own isolated, safe area. An example of a woman who was essentially put in just as much danger as men was photojournalist Claire Starnes. In order to take pictures, she was often placed on the front lines with men, and she would regularly go on helicopter rides through war-torn parts of the country where the helicopter would usually be shot at. Despite the vast amount of danger she was often in, she was not taken seriously upon returning home. She attempted to go to group therapy sessions a few years later, but being the only woman in attendance, she was yelled at and not taken seriously by male veterans. As exemplified by Claire Starnes, women received far less psychological treatment upon returning than the already minimal treatment that men received. They were not seen as actual soldiers by the Veterans Association, and those who tried to join such organizations were not given entry, leaving them with very little support once they got back. Due to their legal status of not technically being soldiers, they were ineligible for any form of compensation or benefits from the U.S. government, as well as often being verbally abused at veteran counseling centers. Many subsects of the anti-war movement did not take women involvement seriously, and therefore were not taken into account during most protests. A primary reason as to why anti-war movements did not focus on women was due to the lack of a draft for servicewomen. Although servicewomen went years without receiving proper recognition for their efforts, a memorial dedicated to the women who served in the war was established in Washington, D.C. in November of 1944, finally giving them the recognition that they deserved.
Michigan seems like a dream to me now. It took me 4 days to hitchhike from Saginaw. I've come to look for